Get out of my kitchen. Lucius Barrick's voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. He stood in the doorway of his hotel's basement kitchen, soft hands, polished shoes, the kind of man who had never once burned his fingers over a stove, and he looked at Rosalie Mercer the way a man looks at a chair he is about to throw into a fire. She had just asked him, for the third time in 5 years, to put her name on the menu. Not the whole menu. One dish, one line of print. Rosalie's braised venison with mountain herbs. 7 words. Barrick crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, snatched the handwritten note she had placed on his desk, and tore it in half without reading past the first line. Then he let the pieces fall onto the floor she had just scrubbed clean. Cook, he said, I own. That is the entire arrangement. If you cannot remember that, there are 100 women in this city who will. Rosalie stood very still. She had learned, over 5 years, that stillness was the only thing Barrick couldn't take from her. She nodded once. She went back to her stove, and that night, while the guests upstairs praised the extraordinary venison stew that had made the Barrick Hotel the most celebrated dining establishment in Denver, while they asked the waiter who on earth had created such a magnificent dish, and the waiter smiled and said, Mr. Barrick has a gift, hasn't he? Rosalie stood alone in the basement and scraped the pot clean. If you have ever worked twice as hard as the person who got the credit, this story is for you. If you have ever been told that your talent was not really yours to claim, stay with us. Because what happened next on a frozen mountain in the winter of 1888 will remind you that some people, no matter how long they are buried, eventually rise. Before we go further, if stories like this are what you come here for, please take a moment and subscribe to our channel. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us the city or country you're watching from tonight. We genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to where everything broke open. The winter that came down on the Blackspire Mountains in November of 1888 was not the kind of winter that poets write about. It was not quiet or beautiful or the sort of cold that makes people philosophical. It was the kind of winter that killed things. It killed cattle, and it killed fires, and it killed the will of men who believed they were tough until the mountains showed them what tough actually meant. Merrick Voss had been ranching in the Blackspires for 11 years. He was 41 years old and he looked 60. Not because he was sick or broken, but because the land had done to his face exactly what 11 years of Blackspire winters does to any face, carved it down to the essential parts and left nothing soft behind. He had a jaw like a fence post and eyes that a younger version of himself might have called brown, but which had turned over the years into something closer to the color of old leather. He didn't waste words. He didn't waste firewood. He didn't waste anything. Ironvale Ranch ran on 12 men, 230 head of cattle, and the absolute refusal of its owner to admit that any situation was worse than manageable. But by the first week of December, the situation at Ironvale was not manageable. His cook had left in October. Pete Garfield, 43, a man of unremarkable talent but reasonable reliability, had received a letter from his sister in Kansas, informing him that their mother was dying. Pete had packed his bedroll and his 3 good knives and ridden down the mountain the same afternoon. He'd promised he would send word of a replacement. He had not sent word of anything. It had been 8 weeks. 8 weeks of 12 men trying to feed themselves. The results had been Merrick searched for the right word. Every time he looked at his hands, which had developed an inexplicable tremble that he was fairly certain was related to 3 weeks of eating beans that had not been properly soaked. The results had been catastrophic. Dale Hutchins, who was 23 and generally enthusiastic about volunteering for things, had attempted a beef stew in the first week and produced something the men had quietly and unanimously agreed could be used to waterproof saddles. Cobb Riley had made cornbread twice. Both times it had emerged from the Dutch oven with the structural integrity of a paving stone. Even Merrick himself had tried once, early in November, standing at the stove with a confidence he did not possess, and had managed to produce something he could only describe afterward as warm but wrong, and which 2 of the men had fed quietly to the dogs when they thought he wasn't watching. He had written to the agency in Cheyenne 3 weeks ago, requesting a camp cook with mountain experience and a strong back. The supply wagon was expected on the 12th of December. Merrick was standing in the yard when it came around the upper bend, the horses working hard against the packed snow. Denny Farlow, driving with his hat pulled down against the wind. Merrick walked out to meet it. Behind him, he could hear the men drifting out of the barn in the bunkhouse, the way men always drift when the supply wagon arrives, slowly. Without appearing to hurry, which means at a near sprint, Denny pulled the horses up and set the brake. "Got your mail," Denny said. "Got your sugar and your salt and your flour. Got a side of smoked pork that weighs about 60 pounds, and God help you if it fell off the wagon on the pass, because I am not going back for it." "Cook," Merrick said. Denny looked at him. "The cook from the Cheyenne agency," Merrick said. "I arranged—" "Yeah," Denny said. He nodded at the back of the wagon. "There's somebody." Merrick walked around to the back of the wagon. Rosalie Mercer was sitting on a wooden crate between the sacks of flour and the smoked pork, wearing a heavy wool coat that had seen better years and holding a battered, cast-iron Dutch oven in her lap, the way a person holds something they are not willing to put down regardless of the inconvenience. She was somewhere in her early 30s. He would learn later she was 34, with dark hair pinned back severely under a felt hat, brown eyes that were taking in everything about him with an expression he couldn't immediately read, and a face that was neither pretty nor plain, but rather composed. The kind of face that doesn't tell you what it's thinking until it decides to. She looked at him. He looked at her. He looked at the Dutch oven. He looked back at Denny Farlow. "Denny," he said. "Yeah, that is a woman it is," Denny agreed.
"I requested a camp cook."
"That's what they sent." Merrick turned back to Rosalie. She had not moved. She was watching him with the patience of someone who had been through this exact conversation before and knew exactly how it was going to try to go. "Ma'am," Merrick said, and his voice was not unkind, which was itself an effort. "I think there has been a mistake." "There hasn't," she said. Her voice was level, not defiant, not apologetic, just level the way a plumb line is level. "This is a cattle ranch," he said. "Mountain winter. We're 60 miles from the nearest town. The conditions here are hard," she said. "Yes, I was told hard as." He stopped. He started again. "Ma'am, I have 12 men and 200 head of cattle, and the pass has been closed twice already this season. This is not a position for a woman," she said. She said it the same way she might say for a left-handed person or for a man with red hair like. It was a fact she was aware of and had already accounted for. "I was going to say for someone without experience in these conditions. I spent 2 winters at a logging camp outside Laramie," she said, "cooking for 40 men. Before that, I cooked at a mining station in the Uintas for 3 seasons. Before that," she paused, and something crossed her face that she did not allow to fully arrive. "Before that, I was in Denver. I know hard conditions, Mr. Voss." He didn't ask how she knew his name. The agency would have told her. He looked at her again. She was not a large woman. She was not built the way he would have expected a mountain camp cook to be built, broad-shouldered, weathered, the kind of physical presence that announced itself before the person did. She was the word that came to him, which he immediately mistrusted, ordinary. The kind of person you would walk past in a city street without your eyes stopping. But she was still sitting in his supply wagon, holding her Dutch oven, and she had not looked away from him once, and that, Merrick Voss had learned, over 4 decades of dealing with people, meant something. "I'm sending you back," he said. "You can ride down with Denny. I'll write to the agency and request." "You'll wait another month," she said. "Maybe 2. Maybe never if the pass closes for the season. I'll manage." Something almost like a smile moved at the corner of her mouth. "Not amusement, more like recognition, Mr. Voss," she said. "How long has it been since you had a proper meal?" He said nothing. "Give me 1 hour," she said. "1 meal. After that, if you still want to send me back, I'll go." He almost said no. He could hear himself about to say no, could feel the word forming the way words form when you've already decided what you're going to say and you're just going through the process of saying it. But then Dale Hutchins, who had been standing 6 feet away, pretending not to listen, made a sound. It was involuntary. It was the kind of sound a man makes when he has been eating Dale Hutchins's cooking for 8 weeks and someone is offering him a meal cooked by someone else, and his body makes the sound before his dignity can stop it. Merrick heard it. He looked at Dale. Dale looked at the ground. Merrick looked back at Rosalie. 1 hour, he said. She was already climbing down from the wagon. What happened in that kitchen in the next 53 minutes? Cobb Riley would let us testify that he timed it. because he was a man who timed things, was the subject of discussion at Ironvale Ranch for the remainder of that winter, and, if you believe some of the older hands who would tell the story years later, for a significant portion of the following decade. She did not produce anything spectacular. That was the first thing Merrick noticed. Standing in the doorway of the kitchen, she did not behave the way he half expected a person trying to prove something to behave. She did not move with performance or theater. She moved the way someone moves when they are doing work they understand completely, efficiently, without wasted motion, with the kind of quiet concentration that is not dramatic, but is somehow more arresting than drama. She had found the venison immediately. There were 2 hindquarters hanging in the cold store, tough and lean, the kind of meat that punished cooks who didn't know what they were doing. She had found the root vegetables that Merrick had not actually looked at since they'd been delivered in October, which were in varying stages of a life well lived. She had found smoked salt in a tin at the back of the shelf, dried herbs in a small bundle that someone had hung there, probably 2 years ago, and forgotten, and she had found in the back of the cabinet, behind a sack of cornmeal, forgotten by everyone, a small glass bottle of apple cider vinegar. She worked. The men gathered, one by one, outside the kitchen door. Not inside, nobody went inside the kitchen while Rosalie was working, though nobody had said anything about it. It was just apparent, in the way certain things become apparent in small communities under pressure, that the kitchen currently belonged to her. The smell, when it started coming out under the door and through the gaps around the window frame, was Dale Hutchins, who had the most experience of failure in that kitchen, and therefore the most appreciation for what success might smell like, would later describe it as like being hit with something good that you didn't know was coming. Cobb Riley said it smelled like his grandmother's house in Ohio. Hector Dunn, the oldest hand on the ranch at 59, said nothing because he went into the bunkhouse very quickly and stayed there for several minutes and came back with his eyes looking like they'd been recently rinsed. And when anyone asked him about it afterward, he told them to mind their business. Merrick stood in the yard and smelled it and felt something happen that he would not have been able to name if his life had depended on it. He went inside. She had set the table. Not elaborately plates, spoons, the tin cups they always used, arranged in a line down the long table the way someone arranges things when they believe order matters. The Dutch oven sat in the center of the table on a folded cloth. Rosalie stood at the stove with her back to him, and when she heard the door, she said, without turning, "Sit down, Mr. Voss." He sat down. The men came in, all 12 of them, quieter than they had ever been at a meal in his memory, and they sat. Rosalie turned from the stove. She carried the Dutch oven to the table. It was heavy. He could see the slight adjustment of her posture to manage the weight, but she didn't ask for help, and she set it on the cloth, and she lifted the lid. The stew that came out of that pot was not fancy. It was not garnished or arranged or presented with any of the theatrical flourishes that Merrick associated, vaguely and without much admiration, with restaurants in cities. It was dark and deep, and it smelled like something that had been building toward itself for a very long time. The venisons had broken down into something that no longer had the tough, resistant character of an animal that had spent its whole life running up and down a mountain. The root vegetables had lost their separate identities and become part of something larger. There was a depth to it. He couldn't explain it. Standing there with a spoon he had picked up without realizing he'd done it, a depth that had no right to be there given the ingredients involved. He took one spoonful, and then something happened that Merrick Voss, who was a private man and who had spent 11 years building walls between himself and anything that required him to feel something unexpected in front of other people, was completely unprepared for. He remembered his mother, not vaguely, not the kind of soft-focused remembering that happens at the edge of sleep. He remembered her specifically, the particular weight of being 7 years old in a warm kitchen in Missouri. The stove crackled and the cold outside made the inside feel like a held breath. The way she moved around the kitchen with that same quality of total ownership that Rosalie had just demonstrated in his. He put the spoon down. He picked it up again. The room around him had gone very quiet, which he gradually became aware of only because men who have been hungry for 8 weeks and are eating something extraordinary do not make noise. They eat with the focus of people engaged in something important. He looked up. Rosalie was standing near the door to the cold store, not eating, watching the table with an expression that was, he looked away from it. He looked back at her. The expression was not pride, exactly. It was something quieter than pride. It was the expression of a person watching other people experience something she had made for them. He said nothing. She said nothing. He finished his bowl. He looked at it when it was empty. He looked at her. "You're hired," Merrick Voss said. And Rosalie Mercer looked at him with those steady brown eyes and nodded once. The same way she had nodded in the wagon when he told her he was sending her back, with the same quality of patience, as though she had known all along how this hour would end and had been waiting for him to catch up. "Thank you," she said. She did not smile. She picked up her Dutch oven and carried it back to the stove. And nobody at Ironvale Ranch that December, not Merrick, not the 12 men who cleared their bowls and looked at each other with expressions of people who have just been reminded what warmth feels like. Nobody understood yet what they had let in through that door. They thought they had hired a cook. They had no idea they had given shelter to a woman who was running from something that was still coming. And they had no idea that the thing she was running from, patient, hired, and already on the mountain trail, would arrive before the worst of the winter was through. But that night, in the warmth of a kitchen that smelled like possibility, nobody knew any of that yet. And for one evening at Ironvale Ranch, that was enough. The morning after Rosalie's first meal at Ironvale, Merrick woke before the sun and lay in the dark for approximately 4 minutes, which was 3 minutes and 50 seconds longer than he normally lay in the dark, trying to identify what felt different. The ranch was the same. The cold coming under the door was the same. The sound of the wind moving along the eaves was the same sound it had made for 11 winters. Then he smelled coffee. Real coffee. Not the burned, gritty approximation of coffee that Dale Hutchins produced by boiling grounds until they surrendered whatever dignity they still possessed. This was coffee that smelled the way. Coffee is supposed to smell dark and round, and something close to honest. He got up. Rosalie was already at the stove when he pushed open the kitchen door, still pinning her hair back with one hand and stirring a pot with the other, and sheet of its windows were dark. And she did not look up when he came in, and she did not say good morning, and she did not make any adjustment whatsoever to her routine to acknowledge that the man who owned the ranch had just walked into the room. She simply handed him a cup, which she had apparently poured and set at the edge of the stove at the moment she heard his boots on the floor, and went back to what she was doing. Merrick sat down with his coffee and said nothing. After a moment, she said, without turning, the stove pulls left. "You need the flue adjusted." "I know," he said. "The flour sack closest to the door has been getting damp. The seal's broken on the bottom. Anything baked with it is going to taste off." He had not known that. "The cold store," she said, and she paused in a way that told him she was choosing her words carefully, "has an organization problem." "Cold store keeps things cold," he said. "That's its function." "Cold store," she said, with the patience of someone explaining something to a person who is intelligent, but has not yet applied that intelligence to this particular subject, "has venison hanging next to smoked pork, next to what I believe was once a wheel of cheese. The venison has been absorbing the smoke flavor from the pork for what looks like at least 2 weeks, and the cheese," she stopped. "We should not discuss the cheese." Merrick drank his coffee. "I'll need a list from you," she said. "What supplies come with the next wagon, what you have on hand, what you're low on. I need to know the full picture before I can plan properly." "You just arrived." "I know." She turned from the stove for the first time and looked at him directly. Her eyes of its windows were dark. Her eyes in the early morning light had that same quality they'd had in the supply wagon. She was looking at him and actually seeing him, which was not as common an experience as it should have been. "I need to understand what I'm working with." He gave her the list that afternoon. She read it without comment, then read it again, then set it on the table and put her thumb on a specific entry and looked up at him. "You have 40 pounds of dried beans," she said. "Yes." "And 12 men." "Yes, Mr. Voss." She looked back at the list. 40 pounds of dried beans is not. These men cannot survive a mountain winter on 40 pounds of dried beans and the goodwill of whatever game wanders close enough to shoot. "We've been managing. I've seen what you've been managing," she said. "Not cruelly, just accurately. Dale Hutchins has a gray color that men don't get from fresh air and hard work. Hector Dunn's hands shake in the morning. That's not cold. That's a body that isn't getting what it needs." Merrick was quiet for a moment. The wagon comes the first week of January. 3 weeks. I can work with 3 weeks if I know what I'm working with. She tapped the list. I'll need to make some adjustments to how the supplies are being used, how the portions are planned. The men won't notice. The men will notice everything, Merrick said. Something genuine moved across her face. Not quite a smile, but a cousin of one. They'll notice a change, she said. They won't notice the reason for it. She was right about that, as she was right about most things she turned her attention to, though it took Merrick longer to admit it than it should have. The first week passed. Then the second. The rhythms of Ironvale Ranch shifted in ways that were difficult to articulate, but impossible to ignore. Mealtimes, which had previously been functional at best and dispiriting at worst, became the axis around which the day organized itself. Not because the food was fancy. It wasn't, couldn't be with what she had, but because it was consistent and it was considered. Rosalie understood something that most people who have never fed large groups of people under difficult conditions don't understand. That what hungry people need is not just calories, but the feeling of being fed by someone who paid attention to the fact that they were hungry. The difference between food produced out of obligation and food produced by someone who has thought about the person eating it is a difference that registers somewhere below the level of thought, somewhere in the body, and Ironvale Ranch felt it collectively within the first week. The ranch hands did not discuss this. They were not the kind of men who discussed such things. But the dinner table got louder. The arguments that had been sharpening through the long weeks of inadequate food, the kind of low-level, fraying-edge irritability that malnourishment produces in groups of men confined together, began to smooth. Cobb Riley, who had not laughed audibly since October, laughed at something Dale Hutchins said over breakfast on the third day, and the table went briefly quiet with the surprise of it, before continuing. Merrick watched all of this and said nothing. He watched Rosalie the way he watched everything at Ironvale carefully, without appearing to, cataloging details and weighing them and making no conclusions faster than the evidence warranted. He noticed that she was up before anyone and the last to stop moving at night. He noticed that she never complained about this, which was not itself unusual. He'd known plenty of people who worked hard without complaint, but that she also never performed not complaining. Never made the visible effort of cheerfulness that people sometimes use to indicate that they are suffering gracefully. She simply worked. When she was tired, she looked tired. When something frustrated her, the stove that pulled left, a pot that had cracked slightly along the handle, the persistent problem of the damp flour, she said so plainly and then dealt with it. He noticed that she always knew when someone was unwell before they admitted it themselves. It was Boyd Calloway who demonstrated this first. Boyd was 28, quiet in the way of young men who came from families where being quiet was the safest option, and he had been looking wrong for 2 days in a way Merrick had filed away as something to watch, but not yet address. On the third morning, Rosalie pulled Boyd aside after breakfast. Merrick saw it from across the yard, saw her speak to him briefly, saw Boyd shake his head, saw her say something else, saw Boyd stop shaking his head, and by that evening, Boyd was in his bunk with what turned out to be a fever that broke in 48 hours instead of the week or longer it might have lasted, if it hadn't been caught and managed. "How did you know?" Merrick asked her the next morning. "The way he was eating," she said. "People eat differently when they're getting sick. Less, usually, but also differently. They reach for certain things and avoid others. And he was holding his jaw wrong. Jaw tension before fever. I've seen it enough times." Merrick looked at her. "Logging camps," she said. "Right." She turned back to the stove. After a moment, without turning again, "You watch people the same way." He didn't answer. "You came in for breakfast this morning, and you clocked every man at the table before you just sat down," she said. "You do it every meal. You think nobody notices." "Do they?" "Hector does," she said. "The rest of them think you're just unfriendly." He almost said something and then didn't, and she didn't press it. And that was the first conversation at Ironvale Ranch that felt like two people talking to each other rather than one person talking and the other waiting for them to finish. There were more of those conversations. They came slowly, unevenly, in the same way most things that matter come, not as dramatic turning points, but as accumulation. Evenings by the kitchen fire after the men had gone to the bunkhouse, when the ranch was quiet enough that the silence became its own kind of company. Merrick was not a man who was comfortable with silence, He had learned to perform with it because the alternative, which was to admit that silence made the size of the empty house more apparent, was not acceptable. But he found that the silence in the kitchen after supper, when Rosalie was finishing the last of the cleaning and he was sitting with his account books he was not reading, was a different kind of silence, the occupied kind. He brought her coffee. She had started doing that for him, and he returned it without thinking about it, and neither of them mentioned it. Why the black spires, he asked one evening, about 3 weeks in. It was not the question he meant to ask, or rather, it was a path toward the question he meant to ask, which he was not yet ready to ask directly. You said you were in Denver, you had work. Rosalie was wiping down the counter. She did not stop wiping. I needed a change, she said. Denver to the top of the black spires in December, he said. That's a substantial change. She was quiet. You don't have to tell me, he said. I know I don't. More silence. The fire popped. Outside, the wind had picked up and was doing something complicated to the corner of the bunkhouse roof that Merrick made a mental note to have looked at in the morning. I worked in a hotel, she said, in Denver for 5 years. Barrack's place, he said. He had heard of it vaguely, the way people who live in the mountains hear of things in the cities below, as rumors of a different world, the one on Larimer Street. Counter stopped moving under her cloth. You know it, she said. By reputation. Good food, everyone says. The pause that followed this was not like the other pauses in the conversation. It had a weight to it. Yes, Rosalie said, good food. And then she folded the cloth over the edge of the sink and turned and looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. In 3 weeks at Ironvale, he had cataloged most of her expressions the way he cataloged most things. The focused look of concentration at the stove, the brief and always slightly reluctant amusement when Dale Hutchins said something genuinely funny, the stripped-down directness she used in practical conversations. But this expression was different. This one had something older in it, something that had been carried a long time. He didn't allow my name on anything, she said. 5 years. Every dish, every recipe, every innovation that made that hotel what people said it was, none of it had my name on it. He accepted the compliments. He accepted the reputation. I accepted my wages, which were, she stopped. They were not fair. They were what he offered, and I needed the work, and I told myself that I was building something, learning, that eventually it would change. Merrick did not say anything. He understood the particular internal economy she was describing, the way people bargain with themselves when they are in a situation that is wrong but survivable. And he knew that the time for it to change was coming in her story, which meant the time before it changed was probably worse than what she had described so far. I asked him, she said. I wrote it down. I actually wrote it on a piece of paper because I wanted it to be clear that I had asked directly and specifically. I asked for my name on one dish, one item on the menu. He tore the paper up in front of me. She picked up the folded cloth from the sink and put it on the shelf and turned back to face the room, and her voice was steady in the way of a voice that has been made steady by practice. And then he told me that if I continued to create problems, he would make certain I never worked in Denver again, that he had connections to every establishment in the city, that a woman with a history of causing difficulties, that was the phrase he used, causing difficulties, would find doors closed against her. But you left anyway, Merrick said. I asked once more, she said. 6 months later. I had worked out the numbers, the revenue from the dining room, my wages, what other establishments paid. I wrote all of it down. I went to him with the numbers. She paused. He told me that if I raised the subject again, I would regret it, not in vague terms, very specifically. Merrick's hand had stopped moving on the account book. I left that night, she said. I took my savings, what there was of it, and my Dutch oven, and I did not go back. The fire settled. The wind hit the corner of the bunkhouse again. The agency in Cheyenne was the first place that answered my letter, she said. Your posting was the first that offered work immediately. So she looked at him steadily. That's why the black spires. Merrick was quiet for a long moment. This man, he said. Barrack. Yes. He still knows where you went? Something moved in her expression quick, barely visible, like a fish passing beneath opaque water. I don't know what he knows, she said. Then, I think it's time I finished up in here. Good night, Mr. Voss. She said it pleasantly enough, but she said it the way you say something when you have said enough and know it, and are stepping back to the right side of a line you temporarily crossed. Merrick recognized it because he did the same thing himself on the occasions when a conversation got closer to something real than he'd intended. "Good night, Miss Mercer," he said. He sat with his account books for another 20 minutes after she left, not reading them, listening to the wind, and thinking about a man in Denver in a good suit who tore up pieces of paper with other people's words on them and thought that was the end of it. Svan sleeps night. He did not sleep well that night. The weeks that followed had a particular texture that Merrick would have found difficult to describe to anyone, not that he would have tried. They were working weeks. The cattle needed tending. The passes needed monitoring. The constant material maintenance of a mountain ranch in winter required daily attention of the most concrete and unromantic kind. But they were also something else. Ironvale felt inhabited in a way it had not felt in years. Not just occupied, which it always was, but inhabited, which is a different thing entirely. The difference between people sharing a space and people actually being present in it together. Rosalie had begun, somewhere around the 4th week, to teach. It started practically enough. Dale Hutchins had come to her, apparently under the impression that this would be a secret, and had asked her to show him how she made the cornbread. Merrick had overheard the request, but pretended not to, because Hutchins's dignity was a fragile thing, and Merrick had some respect for fragile things even when he didn't show it. What he had not overheard was the lesson itself, but he had noticed that Dale had started spending time in the kitchen in the afternoons when Rosalie was prepping for dinner, and that the quality of Dale's cornbread, when he produced Windows batch Saturday morning while Rosalie was outside checking the cold, was dramatically different from anything Dale Hutchins had previously been capable of creating. "Did you teach him?" Merrick asked her. "He asked," she said. "He's not the only one asking." She looked up. He nodded toward the window, through which, if a person looked, they could see Cobb Riley and young Boyd Calloway standing in the yard in a way that suggested they were discussing whether or not to come inside. "Send them in if they want to learn," Rosalie said. "I'm not going to bite anyone." What emerged over the following 2 weeks was something that had no formal name at Ironvale, and that nobody particularly wanted to name because naming it would have required acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would have required certain men to admit that they were voluntarily spending time in a kitchen being taught cooking techniques by a woman who had arrived 6 weeks ago in the back of a supply wagon, which was not the sort of thing that any of them wanted to have to explain to a stranger. But in practice, Rosalie's kitchen became, on the long winter afternoons when the outdoor work was done and the cold made idleness feel like an act of physical suffering, a gathering place. She taught them without condescension and without theater. She showed them the practical things, how to read a fire, how to adjust heat by ear as much as by sight, what dried herbs do versus fresh, and how to compensate for the difference, why soaking beans mattered, and how long and what the water was supposed to look like when they were ready. She answered questions without making anyone feel that the questions were foolish. She did not praise excessive or unnecessary. But she also, and Merrick watched this carefully, from the doorway, from the table, from the various positions he occupied when he was observing something he did not want to be seen. So she also listened to them. She asked questions the way people ask questions when they actually want the answers. She knew that Hector Dunn had come from a cattle ranching family in East Texas, which explained certain things about how Hector approached his work and which Merrick had never known in 11 years. She knew that Cobb Riley had a daughter in Casper he hadn't seen in 3 years because of a dispute with his former wife. Details Merrick didn't know, and Rosalie apparently did. "How do you do that?" he asked her one evening. "Do what?" "Get them to tell you things." She thought about it. "I listen without waiting for my turn to talk," she said. "Most people don't do that. So when someone does, they notice." He considered this. "You're doing it now," she said, evaluating whether that's a useful skill or whether I'm dangerous because of it. He almost denied it. "Both," he said instead. She nodded like he had said something reasonable, which he supposed he had. The thing that Merrick was not acknowledging, even to himself, was the thing that most people looking in and from the outside would have identified immediately, that he had stopped thinking of Rosalie Mercer as the cook. This of its windows were dark, consent, the way most significant changes happen to people who prefer not to change, and he was managing it by not looking at it directly, like a second sun that has appeared in the sky. If you look at it straight on, it tells you something you're not ready to know. So you learn to navigate by its light without acknowledging its source. He started finding reasons to be in the kitchen. Not always. He was not an obvious man, but with a frequency that he would have been embarrassed to quantify. He came for coffee in the mornings and stayed longer than it took to drink coffee. He came with questions about supplies that he already knew the answers to. He came in the evenings with his account books and sat at the table doing arithmetic he had already done. Because the kitchen had become the room on the ranch where he felt least like the man who ran Ironvale and most like a man who had not decided yet exactly who he was, and that feeling was equal parts uncomfortable and something he was not ready to give up. She talked to him differently as the weeks went on, though neither of them acknowledged that either. The professional deference of the first week, the Mr. Voss at the end of sentences, the slight formal holding back had been eroding without drama. She still called him Mr. Voss. He still called her Miss Mercer, but the sentences between those formalities had changed. They argued about things. Small things at first, the best way to extend the smoked pork supply, whether Boyd Calloway was really well enough to be back at work or was performing wellness because he was embarrassed about having been sick, and then larger things, or rather, the same kinds of things, but with less care about the edges. You could be in Denver, he said one night. It was the end of January. The worst of the winter had settled in like something that intended to stay. A place like that, with that kind of talent. You could have your own. My own what, she said. He stopped. My own restaurant, she said. Women don't own restaurants, Mr. Voss. Not in Denver in 1888. I could cook in one, for someone else, under someone else's name, which is what I was doing. There are women who... Name one, she said. Name one woman in this territory who has her name on the door of an eating establishment. He couldn't. That's not me saying it's right, she said. That's me telling you what's real. He was quiet. Then it should be different. She looked at him with an expression that was neither agreement nor dismissal. It should be, she said, but wanting it to be different and waiting for it to be different are two different kinds of wasted time. So what's the third option? She looked at the fire for a moment. You find some place where different is already true, or you make it true yourself. A pause. I'm still working out which one of those is possible. Merrick did not respond. He sat with what she had said the way you sit, with a weight you didn't see coming, not resisting it, just adjusting to its presence. He did not know, sitting there in the warmth of the kitchen with January's wind outside, pressing against every gap and joint of the ranch house, that the thing she was running from had already sent someone after her. He did not know that a man named Silas Crow, who was known in 3 territories for finding people who did not wish to be found, had been given Rosalie Mercer's description and a direction north into the mountains toward a ranch called Ironvale. He did not know any of that. What he knew was that when he looked across the kitchen table at the woman who had arrived 6 weeks ago in the back of a supply wagon, carrying almost nothing, something in the architecture of everything he had built around himself had developed a crack that light was coming through. And he did not know whether that was a disaster or the first honest thing that had happened to him in a very long time. Outside, the wind hit the ranch with fresh force, and the bunkhouse roof made its complicated sound in the corner, and the fire in the kitchen burned steady and low. And Ironvale Ranch held its breath against the cold the way it had for 11 winters, but it did not feel that January night exactly the same as it had in any of those winters before. Merrick picked up his account book. He did not read it. He sat across the table from Rosalie Mercer and listened to the fire and the wind, and he thought that he had spent 11 years building walls in the mountains to keep the cold out, and that the thing he had not understood until right now, in this kitchen, was that if you build walls thorough enough and solid enough to keep out the cold, they will also, eventually, keep out everything else. He thought about what she had said. You find some place where different is already true, or you make it true yourself. He looked at the woman who had arrived with nothing but a Dutch oven and a secret she hadn't told him yet. Not all of it, he could feel it, the weight of the part she was. And he thought that he did not know what Ironvale Ranch would look like in the spring, or whether the woman sitting across from him would still be in it. Thought she should be. He did not say it. He closed the account books were dark, and said good night, and went to bed, and lay in the dark, listening to the wind and trying to remember the last time something at Ironvale had mattered to him the way this already did, and he couldn't find it, which told him something he was not ready to know but was going to have to deal with regardless. Sleep, when it came slowly and without much kindness. And in the cold store right behind him, next to the properly organized provisions and the venison that no longer smelled smoke, Rosalie's cast iron Dutch oven sat on its shelf. Fat, heavy, dark, patient, carrying no name but hers. The February supply wagon brought 3 things Merrick had ordered, 1 thing he hadn't, and news that changed the temperature of the room the moment Denny Farlow delivered it. The 3 ordered things were salt, a replacement Dutch oven lid Rosalie had asked for it specifically, in writing, with dimensions, and 2 months' worth of dried fruit that Rosalie had added to the supply list without telling him. Most of its windows were dark, which he had discovered when he reviewed the order and which he had decided not to challenge because the men had started eating better, and he was not going to argue with results. The thing he hadn't ordered was a copy of the Denver Courier, 3 weeks old, which Denny had picked up at the way station and thrown in as an afterthought because somebody at the ranch would probably want to read it eventually. The news came before any of the supplies were even unloaded. Denny climbed down from the wagon and stretched his back and looked at Merrick and said, "You hear about Barrick's hotel?" Merrick had been reaching for the gate of the wagon. Stopped. "What about it?" he said. Fellow at the way station was talking about it. Said the dining room's been going downhill since fall. People aren't coming like they used to. Some kind of trouble with the kitchen staff. Denny shrugged, the shrug of a man repeating a story that belongs to someone else's world. "Don't know the details. Just what I heard." Merrick said nothing. He unloaded the supplies. He carried the Dutch oven lid inside and set it on the kitchen counter and did not tell Rosalie what Denny had said, not immediately, because he was still thinking about what it meant. He stood in the kitchen while Rosalie examined the lid and fitted it to her pot with the focused satisfaction of someone reuniting 2 things that belonged together. Most of its windows were dark, and he watched her and thought about a hotel in Denver that was apparently beginning to fall apart, and thought about what falls apart when you remove the thing that was holding it together. "It fits," she said, satisfied. "Good," he said. She looked up. She had learned, in the 2 months since December, to read the specific quality of his silences the way she read a stove, what kind of heat it was producing, whether it was building or banking, whether it needed adjustment. "What?" she said. He told her, plainly without embellishment, which was the only way he knew how to tell things. Quiet for a moment. Then she turned and put the Dutch oven on the shelf. "Good," she said. The word was flat and complicated, and he let it be what it was. "Does that change anything for you?" he asked. "Knowing the hotel is struggling?" She thought about it honestly, which he had come to appreciate. She did not answer quickly when quickly wasn't accurate. "It doesn't feel the way I expected it to feel," she said. "I thought it would feel like justice. It just feels like..." She stopped, like watching something rot that should have rotted sooner. He nodded. "It doesn't mean he's done looking for me," she said. That was the thing neither of them had said directly before, though both of them had been thinking it with increasing clarity as the winter wore on. The fact that Merrick had not raised it did not mean he had not been paying attention. He had, with the same steady peripheral awareness he paid to everything on the ranch that represented a potential threat. Rosalie had arrived running from something. The something had not resolved. The winter and the mountain and the 60 miles of difficult road between Ironvale and the rest of the world had provided a kind of buffer that both of them understood to be temporary. "No," Merrick said. "It doesn't mean that." She turned from the shelf and looked at him. "I should have told you the whole of it," she said. "When I told you, I should have... You told me what you were ready to tell me. That's not the same as telling you what you needed to know." He looked at her. "There's a ledger," she said, "or there was. I don't know if it still exists." She sat down at the kitchen table, which was something she rarely did. She was almost always standing in this room, always in motion, and the act of sitting had a deliberateness to it that changed the nature of what was coming. Barrick kept a record. Private accounts. I saw it once. I wasn't meant to. I came into his office to ask about a supply delivery, and the book was open on his desk. I didn't understand what I was looking at immediately, but I understood enough. Names of city officials. Numbers that didn't correspond to any legitimate transaction I'd ever processed. Payments. Merrick was very still. "Bribes," she said. inspectors, licensing authorities. At least 2 men whose names I recognized from the newspapers as being connected to the city council. He was paying to keep the hotel operating outside the regulations that applied to everyone else. Paying to keep complaints dismissed. Paying to keep his reputation managed. And he knew you'd seen it, Merrick said. I don't know exactly what he knew. But when I made my second request, when I went to him with the numbers, she pressed her lips together. He was too specific in his threats. Not just I will ruin your career. He said I would lose more than employment if I continued. He said some sauces couldn't be recovered from. He said it standing in front of the desk where the book had been, and maybe that was coincidence. But it wasn't coincidence, Merrick said. No, she said. I don't think it was. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind was doing what February wind does in the Black Spires, sustained, relentless. The kind of cold that doesn't make noise so much as fill every silence with itself. So he's not just looking for a runaway cook, Merrick said. He may be looking for someone he thinks knows too much, she said. Or he may have decided I'm not a risk and moved on. I genuinely don't know, Mr. Voss. I have been hoping for the second thing and preparing for the possibility of the first. Merrick stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the yard, at the bunkhouse, at the barn, at the white slope of the mountain rising behind everything. And he stood there long enough that Rosalie might have thought he was deciding something, though he had already decided it. Had probably decided it the night she first told him about Merrick, if he was honest with himself, which he was trying increasingly hard to be. Rosalie, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. They both noticed it. You are not going to face any part of this alone, he said. Whatever comes from that direction. He kept his eyes on the window. I want that to be clear. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice had a quality he hadn't heard from her before. Not broken, nothing so dramatic as that, but something in it that had been held very tightly for a long time and had just, slightly, loosened. That she started. Then thank you. Don't thank me, he said. Just tell me if you think of anything else I need to know. He turned from the window. She was looking at him with that expression again. The older one. Most of its windows were dark, the one that had been carried a long distance, and he held it for a moment and then walked out of the kitchen because he was not yet ready to be in a room with that expression and know what to do about it. The night Merrick made that promise. He did not know it was a promise he would be called to keep within 3 weeks. The first sign came from Hector Dunn, who was the oldest hand on the ranch, and whose eyes were therefore the ones most practiced at distinguishing between the different kinds of things that moved on a mountain in winter. Hector came to Merrick on a Thursday morning in late February with the specific economy of words that meant he was serious. Rider on the South Ridge, Hector said. Could be a traveler, Merrick said. Stopped for an hour, Hector said, looking down at the ranch. Then moved on when I went to the barn for a shovel. Saw me and moved. A traveler stopped to observe doesn't move when someone goes to get a shovel, Merrick said. No, Hector said, they don't. Merrick told Rosalie that evening. He did it plainly because she deserved plain, and he watched her face when he did it. She did not go pale or demonstrate anything dramatic. She went very still, which was a different thing, and her eyes did the thing they did when she was calculating, moving slightly, like she was reading something only she could see. How far is the South Ridge? She said. 2 miles from the yard. Close enough to see who comes and goes, she said. Yes. She nodded slowly. Then she said, his name would be Silas Crow. Merrick waited. I heard the name twice in Denver, she said. Both times in connection with Merrick. He finds people. That's what he does. He's patient about it. He doesn't rush. He watches first, and by the time he comes for you, you're already surrounded. He's one man, Merrick said. He's one man who comes in legally, she said. He'll have papers. Something that makes him look like a representative of an interest. If he comes to the door with papers, you can't just... I understand what I can and can't do, Merrick said. But there are things between can't and can that leave a lot of room. She looked at him. I don't want anyone hurt because of me. Then let's make sure it doesn't come to that, he said. But even as he said it, he was not confident, because confidence requires certainty, and there was nothing certain about a hired tracker on the ridge above the ranch, watching, being patient in the way that Rosalie had described. Over the next 5 days, Merrick reorganized Ironvale quietly. He did it the way he did most things. Without announcement, by making small adjustments that individually seemed like ordinary ranch management, but collectively amounted to something quite deliberate. The night watch that the men rotated through casually was formalized and doubled. The sightlines from the main house to the gate were cleared of 2 months' accumulated snow. He had a quiet conversation with each of his 12 men, separately, in which he explained the situation without dramatizing it, and he watched each of them absorb it and register it and reach their own conclusions about what it meant. He had not anticipated, or perhaps had not allowed himself to anticipate, how the men would respond. Cobb Riley said, "She's one of ours," 3 words. Then he walked back to work. Dale Hutchins said, "Tell me what you need," which was more words but amounted to the same thing. Hector Dunn said nothing, which from Hector was a form of complete commitment. Even Boyd Calloway, young Boyd, who still sometimes had the uncertain look of a person who hadn't yet decided what kind of man he was going to be, straightened up when Merrick told him and said, "I can ride if you need riders." Merrick had spent 11 years building Ironvale Ranch. He had always thought of it as something he had built alone: the land, the structure, the cattle, the operation, because the men were employees, and employees were not the same as collaborators, and the distinction had always seemed important to him. Standing in the barn on that February afternoon, watching Boyd Calloway volunteer to ride against a man he'd never met for a woman who had arrived 6 weeks ago in a supply wagon, Merrick revised that understanding. He didn't revise it out loud. He just revised it. He told Rosalie what the men had said. He told her in the kitchen that evening, briefly watching her face while he did. She turned away from him before he finished. She stood at the stove with her back to him, and he could see from the set of her shoulders that she was dealing with something she didn't want him to see her dealing with, which he understood, because he had done the same thing in this room more times than he would ever admit. "Miss Mercer," he said. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was level. It was the practiced levelness. "I know you are," he said, "but you're allowed not to be." A long pause. "Nobody has," she started. She stopped. She tried again. "In Denver, I never told anyone. I worked alone. I lived alone. When Barrick was..." She stopped again. When she spoke next, her voice was quieter, more unguarded than he had ever heard it. "I am not accustomed to people deciding to be on my side." Merrick quiet for a moment. "Get accustomed," he said. She made a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been something else, and she kept her back to him, and he let her, and after a while she turned around and her face was composed again, and she asked him if he wanted coffee, and he said yes, and they sat at the table and drank it without saying much, which was its own kind of language by then. Silas Crow arrived on the first clear day of March. He came up the main road at a walk, which was the calculated choice of a man who understood that rushing in told netrist, that told the other side something you didn't want them to know. He was tall and rode a gray horse that was the same neutral, expressive color as its owner, a horse that didn't attract attention by being anything memorable. Silas Crow himself was built along similar principles: not large, not small, not old, not young. Kind of man you would not describe well afterward because there was nothing to hold on to. He wore a coat that had been good once and was still functional, and a hat pulled low in the way of someone who was comfortable with the shadow it put over his face. He came through the gate without being stopped, because Merrick had specifically instructed the men not to stop him, which had generated a brief but significant moment of dissent from Cobb Riley that Merrick had ended with 4 words. "I want him inside." Silas Crow pulled his horse up in the yard and looked at the ranch house, and then at the barn, and then at the men who had, by no visible coordination, gradually arranged themselves in the yard in positions that were natural enough, individually, but which collectively formed a loose arc behind him and to either side. He looked at this arrangement with the expression of a man who has been in enough yards on enough ranches to understand what it meant. Then he looked at Merrick, who was standing on the porch. "Mr. Voss," Silas said. His voice was the same as everything else about him, controlled, calibrated, without inflection that might betray preference or urgency. "You know my name," Merrick said. "I know a number of things," Silas said pleasantly. "I'd like to discuss one of them with you, if you have a few minutes." "I have time," Merrick said. He did not move off the porch. Silas dismounted. He looped his reins over the post at the yard's edge, deliberate, unhurried, the motion of a man who was managing how he appeared, and he walked toward the porch. "I represent a party in Denver," Silas said. "A gentleman by the name of Barrick. I believe you may have recently taken on an employee, a cook by the name of Rosalie Mercer. I hire a lot of people, Merrick said. Yes, but Miss Mercer is of particular interest to my employer. She left Denver under. He paused with the professional care of a man choosing the word that does the most work, unclear circumstances, owed wages that were never collected. Mr. Barrick is naturally concerned for her well-being and wishes to ensure she's settled any obligations she may have to the establishment before. You can stop, Merrick said. Silas looked at him. I've been running a cattle ranch in these mountains for 11 years, Merrick said. I have heard men talk around a thing more times than I can count. You can say what you came to say. A brief pause. Something shifted in Silas Crow's controlled expression. Not much, just a millimeter of recalibration. I'm here for the woman, he said. My employer wants her back in Denver. She has information that belongs to him, and she took it when she left. What information? That's between Mr. Barrick and Miss Mercer. She works for me now, Merrick said, which means what's between her and anyone else is my concern. Silas looked at the men in the yard. He counted them. Merrick could see him do it, the small movement of his eyes, and he registered the number and what the number implied. Mr. Voss, he said, and his voice shifted register just slightly from the pleasant negotiating tone to something a degree more direct. Mr. Barrick is a patient man. He is also a man of considerable resources. This ranch, he let his eyes move around the yard, the barn, the mountain behind, with the unhurried assessment of someone pricing something. This is a fine operation. I would be sorry to see it complicated by a situation that could be resolved simply. Is that a threat? Merrick said. It's a description of reality, Silas said. Here's my description of reality, Merrick said. He stepped off the porch. Not fast, not aggressive, just down onto the yard level, which changed the geometry of the conversation in a way that was not subtle. There is no woman on this ranch who came to Denver against her will. There is no information that belongs to your employer in my house. There is a cook who is employed here and who has no interest in your employer's concerns. And there are 12 men on this property who share my general feeling about people who come to Ironvale Ranch and describe realities to me. Silas Crow was quiet. He was very good at being quiet. Merrick could see that, the professional quality of it, the way he used silence as a tool rather than a gap. I'll need to speak with her directly, Silas said. Whatever she tells me, that'll end it. You have my word. Your word, Merrick said flatly. I'm a professional, Mr. Voss. I don't complicate things that don't need to be complicated. Merrick was about to respond when the kitchen door opened. Nobody had expected that. The men in the yard didn't move. They had been told not to move unless Merrick gave a signal. But Merrick saw Hector Dunn's hand shift slightly and then stop. Even Silas Crow turned his head with a speed that revealed he was less composed than he appeared. Rosalie came out of the kitchen door and across the porch and down the steps with the Dutch oven in both hands and a small leather-bound book tucked under her left arm. She had not been in the yard during any of this conversation. She had been, as far as anyone knew, in the kitchen. Merrick had not told her Silas was coming today specifically. He had told her the situation was developing, that it might come in the next week, that she should stay in the kitchen if it happened while he handled the initial conversation. He had told her this, and she had looked at him with the steady brown eyes and nodded, in a way that he now understood had meant something quite different from agreement. She walked across the yard with the Dutch oven and the book, and she stopped in front of Silas Crow, and she looked at him the same way she had looked at Merrick on the first day, in the supply wagon, taking him in completely, without apology. You're Crow, she said. He looked at her with an expression that was recalibrating fast. Miss Mercer, he said. I know why you're here, she said. She set the Dutch oven down in the snow beside her feet, carefully, not carelessly, with the attention she gave to everything she handled, and she held up the book. It was small, dark brown leather, the corners worn pale. Mr. Barrick sent you for this. Silas Crow looked at the book. The recalibration in his expression had reached a new position, and Merrick, watching, saw something happen in Silas Crow's eyes that a professional like Silas would not have wanted anyone to see. The book was not what he had been briefed to find. He had been briefed on a woman. Now there was also a book, and the existence of the book was information he had not been given, and information you weren't given is the kind that changes the calculation of a job. Merrick saw it. He did not know what Rosalie intended yet, But he saw that she had changed something in the yard with that book, and he watched. Mr. Merrick, Rosalie said, her voice even and carrying in the cold air, is not primarily concerned with wages or with a runaway employee. He is concerned with this. She held the book up slightly higher, which contains records he does not want seen by anyone with a legal interest in what those records describe. Names of city officials, amounts and dates and services rendered, the kind of records that, in the wrong hands, would bring a significant amount of attention to Mr. Merrick's operation that Mr. Merrick has spent considerable money over several years paying to avoid. The yard was silent. The wind had dropped, which happened sometimes in the Black Spires, for no meteorological reason that Merrick had ever been able to determine. The mountain just occasionally held its breath. Silas Crow was looking at the book. "You want to tell me what's in that book," he said. Not a question. The statement of a man adjusting his working theory in real time. "I want to tell you what happens if something happens to me," Rosalie said. "Or to this ranch, or to anyone on this ranch. That's what I want to tell you." Silas waited. "What's in this book?" She said, "does not stay in this book, if I am not alive and well, and free to ensure it stays in this book. I have made arrangements, several of them, with people in 2 cities who know exactly when to use what they know." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Merrick sent you to find a runaway cook. What you've actually found is the only thing standing between him and a situation that would end his hotel, his reputation, his freedom, and his very comfortable life in Denver. I am not a liability he can eliminate. I am the arrangement that protects him." It was the longest speech Rosalie had made since arriving at Ironvale, and she delivered it without raising her voice and without looking away from Silas Crow's face. And when she finished, she stood in the snow beside her Dutch oven and waited. Merrick had not known what she was going to say. He had known she was going to say something, had known it the moment she came out the kitchen door with that book, and his mind had been moving fast since, mapping what it meant and where it could go and what it required from him. Now he understood the shape of it and his role in it, and he took the step forward that the shape required. "You want to take her back to Denver," Merrick said to Silas. "And doing that turns a straightforward recovery job into something that puts your employer in front of a judge. That's not a job you complete. That's a job you walk away from, because completing it costs more than anyone's paying you." Silas Crow pulled at Merrick. He looked at Rosalie. He looked at the book. He looked at the 12 men in the yard, who had not moved but whose collective stillness had its own weight. The silence in the yard stretched out long enough that Dale Hutchins, who was standing to Merrick's left and had the least experience of anyone on the ranch with situations of this kind, shifted his weight once, and then stopped when Cobb Riley put a hand briefly on his arm. Silas Crow looked at the book one more time. Then he looked at Rosalie with an expression that was the most honest thing she had seen from him since he arrived. Not hostile, not defeated, but recalculating, the way a man recalculates when he realizes the job he took is not the job he was sold. "Mr. Merrick will want a conversation," Silas said. "About the arrangement." "Mr. Merrick can write a letter," Rosalie said. "He knows how to reach me." Silas looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at Merrick. Then he put his hat back squarely on his head. It had tilted slightly in the wind, which was the most human thing about him. And he walked back to his horse, and he mounted without rushing, and he turned the gray horse toward the gate. He did not look back. Nobody in the yard moved until the sound of the hooves was far enough down the mountain road that Hector Dunn's practiced ears registered it as gone, and Hector gave a small nod, and the men in the yard let out a collective breath. That was not quite a sound, but was something you could feel. Merrick turned to Rosalie. She was standing with the book held against her chest now, both arms crossed over it, and she was looking at the gate where Silas Crow had been, and her face had the quality of someone who has just done something that worked, and is still in the immediate aftermath of having not been certain it was going to work. "Rosalie," Merrick said quietly. She looked at him. "The book," he said, and he said it the way he said things when he already knew the answer, but needed to hear it to be certain. She looked at him. Something moved across her face. Not guilt, nothing so simple as that, but the look of a person who has done a necessary thing and is now in the moment of accounting for it. She held the book out to him. He took it. He opened it. Every page was blank. He stood with the blank pages in his hands and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the yard was very quiet. "It's a journal," she said. "I bought it in Denver." I intended to write my biscuit recipes in it. Merrick looked at the blank pages for another moment. Then he looked up at her. Behind him, Cobb Riley, who had very sharp ears and had heard the exchange, made a sound. Dale Hutchins asked what the sound meant. Cobb told him. Dale made the same sound, louder. And then there was laughter in the yard, real and sudden, and the kind that happens when a group of people releases something they have been holding. And it echoed off the mountain face and went up into the cold February air and dissolved. Merrick did not laugh. He looked at Rosalie with an expression that had a number of things in it that he had not decided what to do with yet. Every page, he said. Every page, she said. You bluffed him with a biscuit journal. I bluffed him with the possibility of a biscuit journal, she said, with a precision that was very like her. What was in the book was never the point. The point was what he believed might be in the book. Merrick looked at the blank pages one more time. Then he closed the book and held it out to her. And she took it back and held it against her chest again, and he looked at her, really looked at her, the way he looked at things when he was done, being careful about what looking revealed, and what he felt, standing in the yard in the cold with the laughter of 12 men behind him, was something he recognized despite his considerable unfamiliarity with it. You didn't need any of us, he said. It came out quieter than he intended. She looked at him. That's not true, she said. He waited. I needed somewhere that felt worth fighting for, she said. She was looking at him directly, with those steady brown eyes that always saw more than they admitted. That's not nothing, Mr. Voss. That's not a small thing. The yard had quieted behind them. The mountain above the ranch was white and still, and enormous and entirely indifferent to what was happening below it, which was its own kind of permission. Merrick said nothing. He stood in the yard of the ranch he had built for 11 years, and looked at the woman who had bluffed a dangerous man off his mountain with a blank book and a voice that didn't waver once, and he thought that he had been wrong about a great many things in his life, but that this, whatever this was, whatever name it would eventually require, was not one of the things he was wrong about. He turned and walked toward the barn, because he had work to do, and he was not yet equipped to stand in the yard and be a man who showed what he was feeling, and he had always dealt with that limitation by moving. But at the barn door he stopped. He turned back. Rosalie was still standing in the yard with her journal against her chest, watching him, and she had the expression she'd had when she first climbed down from the supply wagon. That composed, waiting expression of someone who knew how a thing was going to end and was giving the other person time to catch up. Miss Mercer, he said. Mr. Voss, she said, a long pause. That was... He stopped. He tried again. What you did out there was the bravest thing I have seen on this ranch. In 11 years. She looked at him. Her expression shifted. Something in it opened. Just briefly, the way a door opens slightly in a wind before someone closes it again carefully. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. He went into the barn. And Rosalie Mercer stood in the yard of Ironvale Ranch, in the cold March air, with her blank biscuit journal and her cast-iron pot and the particular quality of stillness that comes after a long time of running when you finally, for the first time, feel the ground solid under your feet. The day after Silas Crow rode down the mountain, Ironvale Ranch woke up different, not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself. Cattle still needed feeding, and the water troughs still needed breaking open, where the ice had sealed them overnight, and the barn roof still had the problem in the southeast corner that Merrick had been meaning to address since January and had not addressed because there had always been something more urgent. All of that was the same, but something had shifted in the atmosphere of the place the way press shifts before weather arrives. Not the weather itself, just the particular quality of the air before it. Merrick felt it when he came out of the house at first light and looked at the yard. The men moving between the barn and the bunkhouse moved differently, not fast, not with any visible change in their routine, but with a kind of deliberateness that had not been there before, like people who have discovered that the thing they are doing matters, in a way they had not previously quantified. Cobb Riley caught his eye across the yard and nodded. Not a greeting, they had already greeted each other. It was the nod of a man confirming something that did not require words. Merrick nodded back and went to see about the barn roof. Most of its windows were dark. Rosalie was already in the kitchen when he came back in mid-morning, but the quality of her presence there was different too. She was doing the same things she always did at this hour, prepping the noon meal, taking inventory, moving between the counter and the stove with that particular economy of motion that was entirely her own. But the held-breath quality that had lived in her since December, the sense of a person managing their own weight carefully, was not there in the same way. She moved through the kitchen the way someone moves through a room they are no longer borrowing. She did not mention the previous day. Neither did he. It was not avoidance. They had both said what needed saying in the yard, but the same instinct that makes people not describe a storm while it is still clearing. You let the sky prove itself first. What changed between them after that day was not sudden. It was not the kind of change that makes a sound when it happens. It was the change that occurs when two people who have been carefully maintaining a particular distance simultaneously stop maintaining it, and neither of them says anything about it because saying something about it would require naming it. And naming it would require knowing what to do about it, and neither of them was ready to know that yet. He started calling her Rosalie. Not all the time, not with any announcement. The Miss Mercer still appeared in front of other people and in practical exchanges, but in the evenings at the kitchen table, in the specific kind of sentence that happened when they were talking about something that mattered, her name came out of his mouth without the formality attached, and she let it come without correcting it. She started calling him Merrick about a week after that. He noticed and said nothing, and she noticed that he noticed and said nothing, and that was how that went. The days lengthened. Slowly, the brutal, sustained cold of deep winter began to show its first hesitations. Not warmth. March in the Black Spires is not warm, but a slightly different quality of cold, the kind that contains within it the distant theoretical possibility of something else. The light changed first, the way light always changes before anything else does. And it fell differently through the kitchen window in the mornings, and Rosalie stood in it one morning with a cup of coffee and looked at the slope of the mountain visible from that window and said, without turning, "Tell me about spring here." Merrick looked up from the account books he was actually reading this time. "What do you want to know? What it looks like when it comes?" She was still looking at the mountain. "I've never been this high in the spring." He thought about it. "It comes late," he said. "Later than you expect every year, even when you've been here long enough to know better. The snow starts pulling back from the south faces first. By the end of April, you start seeing ground that's been under snow since October, and it's..." He stopped, because he had been about to say something that surprised him slightly with its sentiment, and he had to decide whether to say it. "It's the color green you forget exists," he said, "every year. You forget what that color looks like, and then it comes back, and it's..." He stopped again. She turned from the window and looked at him. "It's something," he said, which was inadequate, and he knew she knew it was inadequate, and he looked back at the account books. "I'd like to see it," she said. He kept his eyes on the books. "You'll see it," he said. "It'll come." Neither of them said what they both understood that exchange to mean, which was that she was staying, which was a decision that had been made somewhere in the previous weeks without being formally made, most of its windows, and which they were now both referring to obliquely, because referring to it directly would require the conversation that neither of them had yet figured out how to start. Conversation, when it finally came sideways, the way important conversations often do. Not through the front door, but through a gap you didn't know was there. It was the third week of March, and Rosalie had been at Ironvale for 15 weeks, and the afternoon had turned unexpectedly mild in the way that false springs sometimes do in the mountains. Not genuine warmth, just a temporary loosening of the cold's grip that makes the whole world smell like something thawing. Merrick had come in from the east pasture where he'd been checking on a heifer that had been off her feed, and he was still carrying that specific mix of cold air and cattle smell that is the permanent atmospheric condition of a working rancher. And he sat down at the kitchen table, and Rosalie put coffee in front of him without asking. He watched her move back to the stove. "The agency in Cheyenne," he said, turned slightly. "When I wrote to them," he said, after Pete left, "I wrote that I needed a camp cook with mountain experience." He paused. "You don't have mountain experience." She looked at him. "I told you about Laramie. Laramie is not the Black Spires," he said, "and you know it. The logging camp was low country. The mining station in the Uintas was seasonal work, summer months." He kept his voice even. "You came here in December. You told me what I needed to hear to stay. Kitchen was quiet." "Yes," she said. "You could have had trouble," he said. "Real trouble. if the winter had been harder. If the altitude— I know, she said. I knew. She turned fully from the stove and looked at him. I needed somewhere that Merrick would not easily reach. Somewhere that required a reason to go there. The mountains in winter are a reason not to go somewhere. She paused. And I had cooked in hard conditions before, not these exact conditions, but hard enough that I thought— She stopped. I thought I could manage. And if you hadn't been able to, then I would have dealt with that when it happened, she said. The same way I've dealt with everything else. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something he wanted to say and was organizing, the way he organized things, methodically, from the ground up, making sure the foundation was solid before he built anything on it. You came here hiding, he said. I understand that. I understood it before you told me the full of it, and I understood it better after. And I want you to know— He stopped. He picked up the coffee and put it down without drinking it. I want you to know that I am aware of the difference between staying somewhere because you need to and staying somewhere because you want to. And I am not asking you to. He stopped again. Rosalie put her own cup down and sat down across the table from him, which she did not often do in the middle of the day when there was work in progress. She sat down and looked at him directly. Merrick, she said. He looked at her. Ask me what you're trying to ask me, she said. A long pause. Do you want to stay? He said. When summer comes. When the road opens and you can go anywhere. Do you want to stay here? She looked at him steadily. That depends, she said. On what? On whether here means the ranch, she said, or whether it means something else. Kitchen was very quiet. The stove ticked. The winds outside was the mild spring wind, not the brutal winter wind, and the difference was significant. Merrick Voss, who had spent 41 years building walls against exactly this kind of moment, sat across the kitchen table from Rosalie Mercer and looked at the woman who had arrived with nothing and built something out of nothing in the middle of his hardest winter. And he said, it means something else. She looked at him. The composed expression, the careful, held-together quality of a person who has learned not to let the outside in it was there, but there was something happening at the edges of it. I don't know how to do this, she said. I want you to know that. I have spent a long time managing alone. She paused. I am not an easy person. I'm aware, he said. Something crossed her face that was a real smile, not the almost smile, not the reluctant amusement, but an actual smile, brief and unguarded, and completely unlike the composed version of her face that most people saw. You are also not easy, she said. I'm aware of that too, he said. So, she said. So, he said. They looked at each other across the kitchen table of Ironvale Ranch on an afternoon in March when the cold was briefly pretending to be something other than what it was, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and then Rosalie picked up her coffee, and Merrick picked up his— and outside the window, the mountain slope was still white, but at its very bottom edge, just barely, where the south face caught the afternoon light, there was a thin, dark line of exposed ground that had not been there a week ago. The weeks between that conversation and the full arrival of spring were not simple. Nothing at Ironvale Ranch was simple, and the two people at the center of it were not simple people, and the thing that had been acknowledged across the kitchen table did not make everything immediately clear. It made some things clearer, and some things considerably more complicated, because that is what honesty does. It doesn't resolve the terrain, it just removes the fog so you can see exactly how complicated the terrain actually is. Merrick was better at work than he was at words. And he knew it, and he sometimes compensated for the words with the work in ways that Rosalie occasionally found frustrating, and that he occasionally found easier than examining the frustration. She told him this once plainly, the way she told him most things. He sat with it in the way he sat with things, without immediate response, processing it at some depth she couldn't observe. And then, 3 days later, he came in from the yard in the middle of the afternoon, which he never did, and sat down at the kitchen table and said, "You were right about that. I do that." And then he got up and went back outside. And that was his version of an apology. And she accepted it as such because she understood by then how he was built. She was not without her own complications. There were mornings when the old weight came back, the accumulated years of being invisible, of having her work claimed by someone else, of managing alone. And on those mornings, she was not good company, and she knew it, and she didn't always manage it gracefully. On one such morning, she snapped at Dale Hutchins over a minor kitchen matter, with a sharpness that the situation did not warrant. and that she recognized immediately and regretted immediately, and she apologized to Dale before the morning was out, which cost her more than it should have, because apologizing was not something she had been practiced at. Dale had accepted it with a generosity that surprised her, and she had thought about that generosity for several days afterward. What held it all together, in the uneven way that real things are held together, not perfectly, not without gaps, was something that Merrick had said once, in one of the evening kitchen conversations that Rosalie turned over in her mind regularly throughout those weeks. He had said the things that last on a mountain, the things that were built for the mountain, not the things that were built somewhere else and brought up here and expected to hold this. He had been talking about the barn structure, making a practical point about construction materials and local conditions, and she had been half listening, and then fully listening, and then thinking about it long after the conversation had moved on, because it was the truest thing she had heard in a long time said by someone who didn't know they were saying a true thing. April brought the real thaw, not gently. The black spires don't do anything gently, but with the accumulated force of winter releasing all at once. The snow coming off the upper slopes in cascades that could be heard from the yard, the creeks running brown and fast and purposeful, the mud in the yard so total and so determined that Dale Hutchins lost a boot in it one morning and stood in his sock, staring at the hole where the boot had been, with the expression of a man confronting an injustice he has no framework for. The cattle were moved to the upper pastures for the first time since October. This required all hands for 3 days, and Merrick was out from before light until after dark, coming back to the ranch house exhausted in the specific bone-deep way of outdoor work in spring mud, and Rosalie had food on the table when he came back each night, and this was not remarkable in itself. That was her work. That was what she was paid for, but the way she looked at him when he came through the door was remarkable, and the way he looked back was remarkable. And Cobb Riley, who saw it from across the table one night, quietly told Dale Hutchins to look somewhere else, which Dale did. It was the first week of May when the supply wagon came up with Denny Farlow driving and a letter in the mail pouch that bore a Denver postmark and was addressed to Merrick Voss in a handwriting that was not familiar. Merrick took the letter inside. He read it at the kitchen table while Rosalie was at the stove, and his face did the thing it did when he was reading something that required him to remain controlled, and was making that difficult, which meant the muscles in his jaw went tight, and the lines beside his eyes deepened slightly, and he put the letter down, and then picked it up again. "What is it?" Rosalie said. She had not turned around. She had learned to read him without looking at him. He put the letter on the table and slid it toward her. Turned. She picked it up. She read it. It was from a lawyer in Denver. Not a lawyer she knew, not a name she recognized, which meant it was someone Barrick had hired or someone who had heard about the situation through channels she couldn't trace. The letter stated, with the particular brand of legal language designed to convey threat through apparent neutrality, that a party in Denver not named, but identifiable had reason to believe that a former employee had departed with materials belonging to that party, and that said party was prepared to pursue recovery of those materials through formal alms unless a satisfactory resolution could be reached, and that such a resolution would necessarily involve the return of the employee to Denver at the earliest practical opportunity to discuss the matter in person. Rosalie read it twice. Then she set it down on the table with the same deliberateness with which she set her Dutch oven down, controlled, intentional, nothing wasted. "He's trying again," she said. From a distance this time, through a lawyer instead of through Crow. "Yes," Merrick said. "He's not going to stop," she said. She said it the way. She said things that she had already known for a long time, and was now allowing to be fully said. "I thought after Crow left, I thought maybe the bluff had bought enough time, that he would decide the cost wasn't worth it." She paused. "But a man like Barrick doesn't decide that. Men like that don't," she stopped. "Let things go," Merrick finished. "No," she said. She stood at the kitchen table and looked at the letter, and Merrick watched her. He had become, over 5 months, one of the most attentive observers of Rosalie Mercer that had ever existed, not by intention, but by the accumulation of mornings and evenings and meals and conversations, and he could read her now with reasonable accuracy. What he was reading right now was not fear. She had dealt with the fear months ago, had made her private peace with it in whatever interior way she managed such things. What he was reading was the look of a woman who had been carrying something for a long time and was in the process of deciding she was done carrying it the current way. "What are you thinking?" he said. She looked up from the letter. "I'm thinking that hiding is a strategy," she said, "and it worked for a season. But it doesn't," she stopped, "doesn't end anything. It just delays it." "What ends it?" he said, quiet for a moment. "Being somewhere he can't reach me," she said. "Not geographically, legally, publicly." She looked at the letter again. "If I have something of my own, my name on something real, not a bluff, not a pretense, something that a lawyer would have to argue against in front of witnesses." She stopped because she was arriving somewhere in her thinking, and she was doing it in real time, working it out in front of him, which was not something she often allowed, and he could see her processing it the way he processed it himself, from the foundation up, checking each level before adding the next. "Tell me what you need," he said. He said it the same way Dale Hutchins had said it in the barn back in February, when Merrick had told the men about the situation. Plainly, without conditions attached. She looked at him. She had heard that sentence from him before, months ago, in a different context, and she remembered what it had cost him to say it then, and she could see what it cost him now, which was less, because some things get easier with practice. "A kitchen," she said, "my own, with my name on it." She paused. "Not borrowed. Not temporary. Mine." Merrick was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been thinking about the east wing." She looked at him. "The east side of the house," he said. "The room we use for storage. It backs onto the chimney, already running a second flue from it. Wouldn't be. It's workable." He said this in the voice he used when he had already been thinking about something for a while and was now letting the thinking out, which was not the voice of a man improvising, but the voice of a man revealing. "If we extended the east wall 20 feet would do it, and put in proper ventilation. There's a carpenter in the valley, Ned Gorham. He's done good work for other ranches." "Merrick," she said. He stopped. "Have you already drawn this out?" she said. "Pause. In my head," he said. She looked at him with an expression that had several things in it at once. Something that was moving, and something that was fond, and something that was the specific quality of feeling you have when someone has done something without announcing it. "And you realize how long they've been doing it quietly." When she said, "February," he said. "Maybe January." He stopped. "I'm not certain of the exact date." Quiet for a moment. The fire in the stove made its sound. Outside, the first real green of the Blackspire spring was visible through the kitchen window. Not much, just the beginning of it. The thin line of possible green at the bottom of the south slopes that she had been watching advance inch by inch for 3 weeks. "And my name on it," she said. "You said that. You specifically said that." "Yes," he said. "No. Your name. On the door, on the food, on whatever it produces." He said this with the directness of a man who has thought about a thing long enough that the saying of it has become straightforward, even if the feeling behind it is not mine. Yours. She looked at him across the kitchen table of Ironvale Ranch, and she felt something that she had not felt in so long that it took her a moment to identify it correctly. It was not gratitude, though gratitude was in it. It was not relief, though relief was in it too. It was something closer to the sensation of setting a weight that had been carried so long you had stopped registering it as weight. You had just accepted the ache as the permanent condition of being upright. And suddenly, feeling the difference between carrying and not carrying. She picked up the lawyer's letter from the table. She folded it once, twice, with the deliberate care she gave to things she was about to address seriously. "I want to write back," she said to this lawyer. "All right," Merrick said. "I want to write back," she said, "and I want the letter to go out under my name and your name together. And I want it to state that I am a resident of Ironvale Ranch in the Blackspire Mountains, that I am an established professional operating under my own name, and that any further correspondence regarding my person or my alleged obligations to any party in Denver should be directed to my legal representative, whose name I will obtain from the valley by the end of the week." Merrick looked at her. "Can you do that?" she said. "Get a legal representative." "Hitch Caldwell in Millhaven does legal work," Merrick said. "He's competent. He's also expensive." "I'll pay for half," she said. "You don't need to—" "I'll pay for half," she said again. And her voice had the quality it had in the supply wagon on the first day, the plumb-line quality, the level that meant the conversation was over on this particular point. "Half," he said. She nodded. She smoothed the folded letter on the table. Then she looked up at him with an expression that was neither the composed public face nor the occasional unguarded moments he had been collecting for 5 months, but something in between, something that was learning to be in between, learning that in between was possible. "Merrick," she said. "Yes, what you said in March." She was looking at him directly. "In this kitchen. When you said, 'I remember what I said,'" he said. "I want to." She stopped. She was not often uncertain in her speech. She was one of the more precise speakers he had known. But she was uncertain now, and watching her be uncertain was something he found he did not have adequate preparation for. "I want to say that She stopped again. Then, plainly, with the same directness she brought to everything that mattered, "I don't want to leave when the summer comes. It's not strategy. It's not that I have nowhere else to go. It's not because of what Barrick is doing. I want to stay here. She looked at the table and then back at him. "I want what you were asking me about in March. I want the thing you were trying to say." The kitchen was completely quiet. Merrick Voss, who was not a demonstrative man, and had not been a demonstrative man for 41 years for reasons that had seemed sufficient at the time, and now seemed like the most unnecessary waste he could think of, got up from his chair and walked around the kitchen table and sat down in the chair beside her, which was a thing he had never done before, always across the table, always with the table between them like the last wall standing, and he sat beside her, and he said nothing, and she said nothing, and they sat that way in the kitchen they had shared for 5 months, and outside the window, the green at the bottom of the south slope was still advancing, slow and certain, the way real things advance when the conditions are finally right. After a while she said, "I'm still not easy." "I know," he said. "And you are still." "I know," he said. She looked at the window. He looked at the same window. The afternoon light came through it, the way it had been coming through it, all spring different from the winter light, warmer and more direct, with something in it that suggested longer evenings ahead, kind of evenings where staying inside is a choice rather than a necessity. "The East Wing," she said. "The East Wing," he said. "Tell me more about how you drew it out," she said. "In your head," he told her. He told her about the flue placement and the wall extension and the counter height he had been considering. He had been considering counter height, which made her look at him with an expression he could not fully read and did not try to. And the window he thought should face south for the morning light, and the storage he thought she would need, based on 5 months of watching how she worked. He told her all of it. In the methodical way, he laid out anything he had been building in his mind for a long time, and she listened and asked questions about the ventilation and the wood supply, and whether the south-facing window would be high enough to avoid interference with the counterspace. Practical question that showed she was already building it herself in her own mind, and they talked. Its windows were dark, and they talked until the afternoon light through the kitchen window shifted into the particular gold of early evening, and the fire in the stove had burned down and needed tending. And she got up to tend it, and he watched her. An Ironvale Ranch held all of it the way a mountain holds weather. Not perfectly, not without effort, but with a solidity that had been built over time, and that was not going anywhere. He wrote to Hitch Caldwell in Millhaven the next morning. He wrote to Ned Gorham, the carpenter. He wrote to the supply company in Cheyenne with an expanded material list that would not mean anything to anyone reading it without context, but that meant a great deal to him because it was the physical beginning of something that had existed in his head since January. Rosalie wrote to the Denver lawyer. She wrote it herself, at the kitchen table, in the evening, with the specific, deliberate handwriting of someone who has decided that every word is going to mean exactly what it says. She read it to him when she was done. It suggested one changed a word that he thought was imprecise in the second paragraph, and she accepted the change and incorporated it and signed the letter and sealed it and left it on the table to go out with the next wagon. But then she picked up the blank biscuit journal from the shelf where it had been sitting since March, unopened, waiting. She sat back down at the table, and she opened it to the first page. And she picked up a pencil, and she wrote, in the same deliberate handwriting that had just addressed itself to a Denver lawyer, the first recipe she had ever put her name on. Not her first recipe. She had been cooking for 20 years, but the first one she had ever signed. Rosalie Mercer's mountain venison stew. She looked at the words. She looked at her name at the top of them. Then she looked at Merrick, who was reading across the table. Actually reading this time, The account books, for once holding his genuine attention, and she felt the weight of 5 years of invisibility, and another 5 months of hiding, and all the accumulated years of doing things that were hers but bore someone else's name, and she felt it not with bitterness, because she had arrived somewhere past the bitterness, but with the recognition of a person who has just crossed a line they were not sure they would ever get to cross. Kept writing. The fire in the stove burned steady, and even the way fires burn when they are properly fed, and the flue is adjusted correctly, and someone who knows what they are doing is paying attention to it, and outside of its windows were dark, and outside the kitchen window, the south slope of the mountain was dark in the evening, but in the morning it would be there, and the green would have moved further up it overnight, the way it always did in the Blackspire spring, quietly, consistently, without any announcement at all, just advancing. Hitch Caldwell's reply came on the second wagon of May, tucked between a seed catalog nobody had ordered and a letter for Cobb Riley from his daughter, in Casper, that made Cobb go very quiet for the rest of the afternoon in a way that the other men respected by not asking about. Caldwell's letter was 2 pages, written in the compressed legal hand of a man who charged by the hour and had learned to say much in small space. Merrick read it at the kitchen table. Then he slid it to Rosalie without comment, which was his way of saying that the content required her judgment before his. She read it once quickly and then again slowly, which told him something. "He thinks we have a position," she said. "That's what he says. He thinks the letter from Barrick's lawyer was a reaching move," she said. "That if Barrick had real legal standing, he would have moved through official channels in Denver, rather than through a private letter to a ranch in the mountains." "Caldwell's seen this kind before," Merrick said. "Men with money using lawyers the way other men use dogs, to make noise and see what runs." Rosalie set the letter down. "He wants to meet in Millhaven. End of the month," Merrick said. "I can take you down when the east pasture work is finished. Week and a half, maybe 2. She looked at him. The question she was actually asking with that look was not about the timing of the trip. "I'll go with you," he said. "If you want." "I want," she said. Simply, without qualification, which was how she said the things she meant most. The trip to Millhaven was the first time Rosalie Mercer had been below the Blackspires since December. Coming down the mountain road in the wagon with Merrick driving, the world expanded in increments, the trees thickening, then the first farmsteads appearing at the valley floor, then the smell of lower country, warmer and wetter and full of things growing that the high altitude didn't permit. She sat beside him, on the wagon bench, and looked at all of it with the particular attention of someone returning to a world they had briefly left, and are now measuring against what they remember. "It's louder," she said. They were still miles from town. "It always is," he said. "You stop noticing it when you live down here. Then you go up and come back down, and it hits you." "I didn't notice when I arrived in December," she said. "December, everything's muffled," he said. "Snow does that." She thought about December. She thought about the supply wagon and the Dutch oven in her lap and the rancher in the yard, who had looked at her like a problem he hadn't budgeted for. 5 months ago, it felt, sitting beside him now on the wagon bench, with his shoulder occasionally touching her, road dipped, like something that had happened, a version of herself, that she could see clearly but no longer fully inhabit. Hitch Caldwell was a small man with very large glasses, and the slightly distracted manner of someone who is always running 2 conversations simultaneously, the one he is having and the more important one happening inside his own head. He shook Merrick's hand and then Rosalie's, and looked at her over his glasses with the assessing about a person who has been told something about a person and is comparing the report to the reality. "Miss Mercer," he said, "I've read your situation." "Mrs. Voss?" Merrick said. Caldwell looked at him. Rosalie looked at him. Merrick looked at neither of them. He looked at the wall behind Caldwell's head with the expression of a man who has said an accurate thing and is waiting for the room to catch up to its accuracy. There had been no formal proposal. There had been no ceremony, no ring, no moment in a field or by a fire with one person on their knee and the other with their hand to their mouth. What there had been was a conversation, 3 days before the trip to Millhaven, in the kitchen, early morning, when the light was still the gray-blue of before sunrise, and Rosalie was at the stove, and Merrick was at the table with coffee, and he had said, without preamble, staring at his cup, "I think we should get married." And she had stirred whatever was in the pot, and not turned around and said, "I think so too." And he had said before or after Millhaven. And she had said before. I want to sit across from that lawyer with my own name legally attached to something real. And he had said, I'll arrange it. And she had said, I'll arrange it. You arrange the East Wing. And that had been that. They had been married by the Justice of the Peace in the Valley 2 days ago. Dale Hutchins had driven them down and back and told no one what the trip was for, until they were on the return road. And Merrick had said he could tell people now, at which point Dale had informed both of them that they were the most peculiar couple he had ever been adjacent to, and that he meant that as a compliment, which they had both accepted in the spirit offered. Caldwell adjusted his glasses and looked at his papers and made a small sound of recalibration. Mrs. Voss, he said. All right, he shuffled papers. Your position is stronger than the other party anticipated, I think. A married woman with legal residence, an established professional identity, no documented obligations to the claiming party. He looked up. You left voluntarily? No contract? Verbal arrangement only, Rosalie said. Nothing signed. And the materials he claims you took? Cast iron pot, she said, which I purchased myself and which I have a receipt for, though it's 5 years old. Caldwell looked at her. He's claiming a pot? He's claiming, she said carefully, that I left with information belonging to him. He has not specified what information, because specifying it would require him to explain what the information was, which would require him to explain why that information existed. Caldwell was quiet for a moment, putting things together in the way of a smart man who is also a careful one. I see, he said. I don't have anything of his, she said. I never did. What I have is memory, which is mine. And he knows that, Merrick said. He's not actually trying to recover anything. He's trying to establish a channel of contact, to find out whether she's a threat. Caldwell took his glasses off and cleaned them, which appeared to be his version of taking a moment. What I would suggest, he said, is a letter from this office, formally establishing your residence and professional standing and requesting that all further communication go through me. That puts a lawyer between you and whatever he sends next. He put the glasses back on. It also signals that you are not running. A person who is not running and who has legal representation is a substantially different problem than a person who is hiding. That's what I want, Rosalie said. I want to stop being a problem he thinks he can solve with a threat and start being a situation he has to calculate. Caldwell looked at her for a moment, with something that was almost admiration, the restrained professional kind. I can do that, he said.
Return trip up the mountain took the better part of a day.
The wagon climbing the switchback rode through country that changed incrementally from valley green to the spare high-altitude landscape that Merrick had lived in for 11 years, and that Rosalie was, she understood on the climb back, beginning to think of as hers. Not in the possessive way of ownership, but in the way of belonging. The way you belong to a landscape when it has seen you at your worst and your most exposed, and it has simply continued being what it is, which is its own kind of acceptance. How do you feel, Merrick asked her. They were halfway up, the wagon working hard on the grade. She thought about it. Like something shifted, she said. The letter Caldwell sends won't change what Merrick is, but it changes what I am in relation to him. And that's, she paused, that's the thing I couldn't find for 5 years. How to change that relation without disappearing. He drove for a while without speaking. Then you didn't disappear. You relocated. She looked at him. There's a difference, he said. Disappearing is giving up your position. Relocating is choosing a better one. She thought about that for a long time, all the rest of the way up the mountain. Ned Gorham, the carpenter, arrived at Ironvale in the first week of June with 2 apprentices and a wagon full of lumber that Merrick had ordered in quantities that made Rosalie's eyes go slightly wide when she saw the delivery, though she said nothing, because she had learned that Merrick doing things thoroughly was not something that benefited from comment. Construction of the East Wing kitchen began that week. It was not a quiet process. The sound of hammers and saws became the background music of Ironvale Ranch through June, competing with the cattle and the wind and the ordinary sounds of a working operation, and the men adapted to it the way men on working ranches adapt to most things, by incorporating it into the texture of the day without breaking stride. Rosalie had drawn it out by then. Not in her head, the way Merrick had on paper, with the careful precision of someone who had been thinking of her own, would look like kitchen of her own for 5 years, and now had the opportunity to make those thoughts specific. She had drawn the counter placement and the stove position and the window that faced south for the morning light and the storage wall and the ventilation, and she had sat down with Ned Gorham on the first morning and gone through it with him the way she went through supply lists, methodically, with specific reasoning for each element, open to practical adjustments, but clear about which things were not adjustable. Ned Gorham was 60 years old and had been building things in the Blackspire Valley for 35 of those years, and had opinions, as craftsmen of long experience tend to have opinions, about the right way things should be done. He and Rosalie had 3 significant disagreements in the first week, all of them about practical matters, and all of them resolved through a process that the apprentices watched with the fascination of people observing something they had not seen before, which was Ned Gorham being woman's reasoning persuaded without requiring anything other than the quality of the argument. Merrick stayed out of it. When Ned came to him to ask about the counter height, which had been one of the points of contention, Merrick looked at him and said, "Ask Mrs. Voss," and went back to what he was doing, and Ned Gorham stood for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating, and then went to ask Mrs. Voss. The kitchen went up through June. The frame first, then the walls, then the roof that tied into the existing structure at the east end of the house, and then the interior, which Rosalie watched take shape from the outside, because she had made a private decision that she was not going to go inside until it was finished, the same way you don't open something before it's ready. On the last day of June, Ned Gorham came to find her in the main kitchen where she was prepping the evening meal, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said, "It's done, Mrs. Voss." She wiped her hands on her apron. She followed him around the outside of the house to the east door, a proper door, solid with a frame that Ned had built square and true, and she stood in front of it. Above the door, in carved letters that Ned had done himself, unbidden, as what he later described to his apprentices as simply the right thing to do given the circumstances, Rosalie's kitchen. She stood looking at it for long enough that Ned became slightly concerned, and then she put her hand on the door and pushed it open and went inside. The morning light through the south window was exactly what she had drawn. The counter height was what she had specified. The stove, a proper stove, new, which Merrick had ordered from Cheyenne, and which had arrived on the May wagon as a collection of parts and been assembled by the apprentices under Ned's direction sat, where she had placed it on the drawing, and it was level, which she checked immediately with the small level she kept in her apron pocket, and it was level. She stood in the center of the room and turned around once, slowly looking at all of it. Merrick was in the doorway. She had not heard him come. She did not know how long he had been standing there. She looked at him. She did not say anything, and he did not say anything, most of his window, and the morning light came through the south window and fell across the floor of a kitchen that had her name above the door, and it was enough. She moved her Dutch oven into the new kitchen that afternoon. She carried it herself, the way she had carried it into Ironvale on the first night, and she set it on the new stove and looked at it sitting there, and she thought about December and the supply wagon and the man who had looked at her like a problem, and she thought about all the things that had happened between that December and this June, and she felt the full weight of all of it, not with grief, not with bitterness, but with the kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop moving fast enough to see where you've been. The East Kitchen changed things at Ironvale in ways that were immediate and practical, and also in ways that took longer to name. The most immediate was that Rosalie now had space to do what she had always been capable of doing without the constraints of the main kitchen's limitations. The stove that pulled left, the inadequate counter space, the storage that was perpetually insufficient. In the new kitchen, she could work at full capacity, and the difference in what came out of it was evident to everyone on the ranch within the first week. But the other change, the one that mattered more, was the one that happened the morning the first travelers stopped at Ironvale. It was mid-July, a party of 4-2 cattlemen from the valley moving stock north. Their 2 hands had come up the mountain road and stopped at the ranch gate to ask about water for their horses, and whether there was any chance of a meal. This was not unusual at mountain ranches, which functioned as informal stopping points on long routes. What was unusual was what happened after Rosalie fed them. The older of the 2 cattlemen, a man named Arden Walsh, who had been running cattle in the territory for 40 years, and who had the particular authority of someone who has been doing a thing long enough that their opinions about it have become a form of expertise. This man ate his meal and sat for a moment and then looked at the plate and looked at Rosalie and said, "Who cooked this?" "I did," she said. He looked at her. "Where did you train?" he said. "I didn't," she said. "I taught myself." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have eaten at the best establishments in Denver and San Francisco and twice in Chicago. And this—" He stopped. He looked at the plate again. "This is the finest meal I have eaten in 20 years. Rosalie did not know what to do with that, which was itself remarkable, given that she was not easily thrown. She said thank you and went back to the kitchen. And Arden Walsh paid for his meal and his hands' meals at a rate considerably above what Merrick had mentioned when Walsh asked the price, and when he left, he told Merrick at the gate that he would be telling everyone he knew about the woman cooking at Ironvale Ranch. He was not wrong that he would tell people. He was also not wrong about the quality of the information he was spreading, because word moved in the mountains the way water moves, finding the easiest path, going everywhere eventually, and by August the stopping at Ironvale had become regular enough that Rosalie had developed a system for managing it. By September it was not stopping anymore. It was something closer to a destination. Miners coming down from the high claims, freight crews on the mountain routes, families at windows, families traveling between valley settlements who had heard about the kitchen at the Voss Ranch and adjusted their route to pass through it. The ranch hands had gradually taken on additional roles. Boyd Calloway, who had a natural ease with people that Merrick had never known how to use until now, became the unofficial front of house, greeting arrivals and managing the informal dining that had developed around the 2 long tables that Merrick had built and placed in the room adjacent to Rosalie's kitchen. The money that came from it surprised Merrick, though he told Rosalie later that it should not have surprised him given what he had watched her produce on a daily basis for 9 months. He had been running Ironvale on cattle for 11 years, and the margins were what they always were: sufficient, never more than that, and always contingent on weather and market prices and the particular cruelties of a mountain operation. What Rosalie's kitchen added to the operation by the end of summer was not sufficient. It was more than sufficient. It was the difference between a ranch that survived each year and a ranch that was building something. He told her the numbers one evening in September. She sat with them and looked at him. "That's more than I thought," she said. "Yes," he said, "by a significant amount." Yes, she was quiet for a moment. "Then we should hire help for the kitchen?" "For the kitchen," she said. "I can't—" She stopped. She said the next thing in the particular way of someone who is admitting something they have been slow to admit. "I cannot do the volume we're being asked to do alone. Not at the standard I want to do it at. And I refuse to let the standard drop." "Who do you have in mind?" he said. She had, turned out, been thinking about this for some time. There were 2 women in the valley. She had met them on the trip to Millhaven and had followed up with correspondence, which Merrick had not known about, and which revealed again that Rosalie Mercer conducted multiple operations simultaneously in the quiet of her own thinking women, who were capable and who were, for reasons that were familiar to Rosalie, if not to Merrick, underemployed. One was a widow's were dark. One was a widow in house kitchen for 8 years before her husband's death had required her to sell the property. One was younger, 22, who had been cooking for her father's freighting crew and whose talent, Rosalie said, was considerable. "I want to train them," she said. "Not just hire them. Train them. The way I wish someone had trained me." Merrick looked at her. "Properly," she said, "with the intention of them being good enough to do this work at the level it deserves. Not as assistants, as people who know what they're doing and why." "Apprentices," he said. "Yes," she said, "something like that." The 2 women came to Ironvale in October. Margaret Voss, the widow, and a young woman named Clara Dent, who had ridden up from the valley with the look of someone who has been told a thing is possible and is arriving to find out if that is actually true. Rosalie met them at the gate, which Merrick thought about later as the detail that told you the most about who she had become at Ironvale. She had arrived at this gate in a supply wagon, being questioned about whether she belonged here, and now she was the one standing at it, waiting to let someone else in. She was not a patient teacher in the way that patience is sometimes confused with passivity. She was demanding in the specific way of someone who demands, because they believe the person being demanded of is capable of meeting the demand, which is a different thing entirely from demand. You enjoy demanding. She corrected Clara's knife work 17 times in the first week, and on the 17th time, Clara, who had some spirit in her, said, "I'm doing it exactly the way you showed me." And Rosalie said, "You're doing it correctly and not yet well." Correct and well are not the same thing, and Clara looked at her and then looked at what she was doing, and something changed in how she held the knife. And Rosalie said nothing, but stepped back and let her work. Merrick Voss was different, quieter, more careful, with the specific competence of someone who has been doing things alone for a long time and has developed efficient but idiosyncratic methods. Rosalie worked with her differently, not by replacing what she knew, but by showing her how what she already knew connected to things she didn't. By December, 2 months in, Margaret was making decisions in the kitchen, independently, that Rosalie didn't second-guess, which was not nothing. Rosalie did not second-guess things lightly. The letter from Hitch Caldwell arrived that same December 1 year, almost exactly, from the night Rosalie had first stepped off the supply wagon at Ironvale. It was brief. Caldwell wrote that he had received no further communication from the Denver lawyer or from any party connected to Lucius Barrick. He wrote that he had, however, received some information from a contact in Denver that he thought she should have, and which he conveyed in the next paragraph. The Barrick Hotel's dining room had closed in October. Not the hotel itself. The rooms were still operating. But the dining room, which had been the center of its reputation, had closed because the kitchen could not sustain the quality that the hotel's reputation demanded. There had been a series of changes in kitchen personnel over the preceding year. None of the replacements had worked. The review in the Denver Courier, Caldwell wrote, had been quite severe, and he did not have the review itself, but his contact had described it as the kind of review that establishments did not recover from in a city where reputation was currency. Lucius Barrick was still operating. He was not ruined. But the thing he had built, the particular shining thing he had built, on the talent of a woman he had kept in a basement and never named, that thing was gone. Rosalie read the letter at the kitchen table. Merrick sat across from her and watched her read it. When she finished, she folded it and put it on the table and looked at the window. As outside, the first snow of the new winter was coming down, the black spires beginning their annual ceremony of becoming themselves again, and the light through the kitchen window was the flat gray-white light of a mountain December, not beautiful in any obvious way but familiar now in a way that lived in her bones. "How do you feel?" Merrick asked. He asked it the same way she had asked him once, on the wagon to Millhaven, simply without expectation about the answer. She thought about it for a long time. "I feel like it's over," she said. "And I feel like that's different from justice, but it's also not nothing." He nodded. "I wasted 5 years on a man who was never going to give me what I'd earned," she said. "That doesn't change. Those years don't come back." "No," he said. "But the kitchen closes, and my kitchen is still open," she said. "And what I built here," she stopped. She looked at the window again. "He could not have built what I built here, even if someone handed it to him, because what I built here is built out of things he doesn't have and never did." Merrick was quiet for a moment. "Then what things?" She looked at him. The look was direct and unguarded in the way she had learned, over a year, to allow herself to be unguarded with him. Not without effort, not automatically, but genuinely, which was better than automatically. "The ability to care whether people are fed," she said. "Not whether they're impressed, whether they're actually fed." She paused. "You can fake technique. You cannot fake that." He looked at her across the table of the kitchen where they had been having evenings for a year, and he thought about December of the previous year, about the man he had been then, who had looked at a woman in a supply wagon and thought about sending her back, who had eaten one bowl of stew and felt something crack open in him that he hadn't known, was sealed. And he thought about who he was now, which was the same man in the same mountains, but different in the way that matters, in the interior way, the way that doesn't show on the surface, but changes every decision you make from the inside out. "You know what I've been thinking about," he said. "Tell me," she said. "The spring," he said. "What we're going to do with it." She looked at him with the beginning of the expression, not quite the smile, the cousin of it. "I have some thoughts about the spring," she said. They talked until late. not about the past. They had both, in their separate ways, said what needed saying about the past, and the past had been given its weight and its due, and then set at a reasonable distance. But about the spring, and what the spring made possible, and what they wanted Ironvale to be in another year, 5 years, 10 years, which was the kind of conversation that is only possible between people who have agreed, without fanfare, that they are going to be in the same place long enough to find out. The things they discussed that evening, in the kitchen of a ranch in the Black Spire Mountains on the first night of a new winter, expanding the stopping capacity of Ironvale to handle the freight crews that had been coming regularly since August, building a proper road connection to the valley track that would make the approach less brutal in early spring when the mud made the existing road nearly impassable. Bringing in a third apprentice, Rosalie had someone in mind, a girl in Millhaven, 14 years old, whose mother had written to the ranch after hearing about the kitchen from Arden Walsh. And Merrick, at some point late in the evening, when the fire had burned down and needed stoking, and neither of them had gotten up to stoke it, yet said, "I've been thinking about a sign." She looked at him. "At the valley turnoff," he said, "where the road up to Ironvale branches off the main track. A sign that tells travelers what's up here." He paused. What to expect? What would it say? She said. He looked at her with the expression he had developed over a year, the one that was not quite a smile on a face, not built for smiling, but which meant what smiling means, and which she had learned to read as accurately as she read anything. "Rosalie's kitchen at Ironvale Ranch," he said. "Travelers welcome, 1.5 miles up." She said nothing for a moment. "That's my name first," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at the window. The snow outside was steady and serious, the first real snow, the kind that knows it is going to stay. Through it, barely visible in the dark, the shape of the barn and the bunkhouse and the mountain above, the mountain that had been here 10,000 years before anyone, arrived and would be here 10,000 years after everyone, was gone, and which did not care about any of them, but which they had chosen anyway, and which had, in its indifferent mountain way, held them. "All right," she said. She got up and stoked the fire. The battered cast iron Dutch oven hung above the great hearth in Rosalie's kitchen at Ironvale Ranch, and it had hung there since the morning after the east wings finished, when Rosalie had carried it in from the stove where she'd placed it the day she moved in and hung it on the iron hook above the hearth that Ned Gorham had installed without being asked, because Ned Gorham was the kind of craftsman who understood that some things belonged displayed rather than used. It was not decorative in the way of things placed for decoration. It was black and heavy, and one side had a slight imperfection in the casting that had always been there, and that Rosalie had always known was there, and it was worn in the specific way of something that has been used very hard for a very long time. People who came through Ironvale noticed it and asked about it, and Rosalie told them, or Clara told them, or Margaret told them, depending on who was nearest, and the answer was always the same. The cook brought it the first night she arrived in December of 1888, in the middle of winter, with almost nothing else, and with it she made a meal that changed the ranch. The travelers who heard this story were mostly men, mostly rough-handed and practical in the way of people who work outdoors in hard country, and most of them listened to the story and looked at the pot and said something like that, and went back to their meal. But some of them sat with it. Some of them ate their meal in the particular quality of attention that the story produced, the attention of people remembering their own versions of arriving somewhere with almost nothing and finding out whether what they had was enough. Most of its windows were dark. The sign at the valley turnoff in March, when the snow was melting and the road had dried enough for Ned and his apprentices to come up and plant the posts. Merrick had specified the wood and the dimensions. Ned had cut the letters. The sign read exactly what Merrick had said it would read, in letters that were plain and square and weather-resistant, and that a person on horseback could read from 30 yards away in average light. The first morning it was up, Merrick rode down to the turnoff by himself to look at it. Most of its windows were dark. He sat on his horse and looked at the sign and thought about a lot of things, most of which he would not have been able to articulate and did not try to. He thought about what it meant to put another person's name at the beginning of a sentence about your own property, and how that had felt. The morning he proposed the sign to Rosalie, like the most obvious thing he had ever said, which told him something about how far he had traveled from the man he'd been the previous December. He rode back up to the ranch. Rosalie was in the kitchen, came to the door, and she looked up. "It's up," he said. She nodded. She turned back to what she was doing. He went to do his work. That was it. That was the whole of the moment, which was exactly the right size for it. Lucius Barrick's name faded, the way names fade when they are not attached to anything that lasts. The hotel on Larimer Street changed hands twice in the 2 years following the closing of the dining room, and by 1891 it had become something else entirely, a different kind of establishment under a different name, and those who had once praised it for its extraordinary cuisine had mostly moved on to other superlatives about other places. The man who had accepted the compliments for years had them gradually withdrawn, not dramatically. No one particular reckoning, no public unmasking, but in the incremental way that reputations built on borrowed substance erode, slowly, thoroughly, without recovery. Rosalie heard about this in pieces, through the letters Hitch Caldwell occasionally sent with news from the city, and through Denny Farlow, who picked up gossip the way a good supply driver picks up everything systematically, without judgment, filing it for later use. She received each piece of news and set it down and moved on, because there was always work in the kitchen and students to teach, and the endless practical demands of a mountain ranch that was growing, and the distant deterioration of a man who had once frightened her was at a certain point simply information rather than anything that required a response. What required her response was in front of her every day. Clara Dent, by the end of her second year at Ironvale, was producing work in the kitchen that Rosalie watched with the specific pride of a teacher who has watched a student surpass the point the teacher had expected them to reach. Clara had the thing that could not be taught, the attention, the genuine investment in whether the person eating was actually fed, and Rosalie had given her everything else. And the result was a cook who was, at 24, already someone that people in the valley talked about when they talked about Ironvale. The girl from Millhaven, Bess Harmon, 14 when she arrived, small and quick and ferociously interested, and everything had attached herself to Merrick Voss first, and then to Rosalie in the way of people who learn by proximity, by watching, by asking questions until they understand something completely. She was going to be exceptional. Rosalie knew it the way she had always known things about people before they knew it themselves, and she told Bess plainly, because she believed in telling people plainly, and she watched what honesty did to the girl. Not inflated her, but steadied her, the way a good truth steadies a person who has been uncertain about the ground they're standing on. There were mornings, not many, but some when Rosalie stood at the window of the east kitchen in the early light and thought about the basement kitchen in Denver and what those 5 years had cost her, and she let herself think about it rather than routing around it, because she had learned, slowly and with considerable effort, that the things you refuse to look at do not go away, but instead arrange themselves in the dark and become obstacles. She looked at it. She counted what it had cost. She set it accurately against what it had also, in its terrible way, produced not the suffering itself, which she refused to sentimentalize, but the skills that suffering had built, the knowledge of her own endurance, specific clarity about what she would and would not accept that had made it possible for her to stand in a yard in winter with a blank biscuit journal and not flinch. She did not conclude from any of this that it had been worth it. She was not interested in that kind of accounting. What she concluded was simpler and more durable, that she had come through it, and that coming through things is its own kind of knowledge, and that the knowledge lived in her body the way all real knowledge does, and that no one could take it from her because it was not something that existed on paper or in a ledger or in the opinion of anyone else. Her name was above the door. Her recipes were in the journal, now almost full, in the deliberate handwriting that had been writing things down since December of 1888, not because she needed to remember them, but because she had decided that what she made would be recorded as hers, documented and signed and permanent in the way that Barrick's credit for her work had never been and could never be made to be. The last page of the journal, she saw it coming, the pages running out, the way you see the end of a long road appearing in the distance before you reach it. The last page she left blank. She left it blank on purpose, which Merrick noticed when she showed him the finished journal one evening, and which he did not ask about immediately, because he had learned her, and he knew that the blank page meant something she would explain when she was ready. She explained it a week later. They were in the kitchen after the day was done, the late summer evening, going golden through the south window, and she picked up the journal from the shelf and held it and said, "The first time I held this, it was the only thing I had that I could pretend was ammunition. I was terrified, and I stood in that yard, and I held a blank book like it was a weapon, and I told a lie, and it worked." She paused. "I want to remember that the blank page can be a beginning, or it can be a bluff, and you don't always know which one you're holding until later." She set the journal back on the shelf. "And I want to remember that I once had nothing, and I still won." Merrick looked at her. "That's the most I have ever heard you say at one time," he said. She looked at him with the expression, "The real one, not the cousin of it." "Don't get used to it," she said. He almost smiled. On his face, which was not built for smiling, it arrived as a slight rebuilt arrangement of the lines beside his eyes and the particular set of his jaw, and she knew it and recognized it for what it was, and that was enough, because enough had always been enough for both of them, which was one of the reasons that what they had held. Outside the south window, the mountain was itself. Green in the high summer places, bare rock above that, and above that, the snow that never entirely left no matter the season, white and permanent, and entirely indifferent to everything below it. The ranch in the valley of the mountain was not indifferent. The people in it were not indifferent. They had chosen to be here, on this difficult ground, in this weather, with all of this, and the choosing was the thing, the ongoing daily choosing, which was harder than arriving and more important than any single moment of courage or clarity or bluff. A woman had arrived in December with nothing but a pot and a secret, and the particular quality of stillness that comes from a person who has decided to stop being moved by the thing that has been moving them. She had not arrived to find a home. She had arrived to find cover, and she had found, instead, the conditions under which she could build one. Not the one she had imagined, nothing so clean as that, but the real kind, which is made of specific mornings and difficult conversations, and the gradual accumulation of trust between people who both know what it costs and choose to pay it anyway. Above the door, her name. On the shelf, her journal. On the stove, her work. And at the table across the kitchen, looking at the account books he was actually reading, most of its windows were dark. The rancher who had looked at her like a problem on the first night and had spent everything since learning that he had been wrong, and who was not sorry about it, and who was not finished. Neither was she.